Hello and welcome to this edition of A Page from History. I am Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay. 5.5 decades or 55 years ago, Fidel Castro became the Prime Minister of Cuba. This was preceded by the Cuban Revolution, when Castro's rebel troops entered Havana, forcing President Batista, his family and associates to flee. Castro ruled Cuba with an iron fist for almost 5 decades. Two conflicting images of Castro have dominated public perception. The first sees him as a champion of the poor who introduced social welfare system. The other sees him as a tyrant who jailed dissidents, ruined the economy, and forced hundreds of thousands of Cubans to flee their country. The truth about Castro really was in the midst of conflicting images and opinions, and it may be a mix of everything. But to talk about this enigmatic world leader, I am joined by an extremely competent panel. My first guest on this program is Professor Aparajit Chattopadhyay, a professor of Latin American Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, senior journalist and commentator M.K. Tikku, and finally we have Ash Narayan Roy, the director of Institute of Social Sciences. Ash Narayan Roy, I would like to begin with you to give us an understanding into the backdrop and the historical significance and the setting which led to the rise of Fidel Castro in Cuba.
Yeah, in fact, the very rise of Fidelistas, that is a Fidel Castro-led movement, came as a bit of surprise, because what had happened before that was that every such attempt by certain groups, whether it is in the Caribbean or in Guatemala or elsewhere, had been crushed by the CIA or by the American-led operations.
Right.
And hence, not many expected that any such movement will rise up and succeed in a small island
and be able to actually come to power.
Exactly, under the very nose of the United States. After all, Miami is just 90 miles off the coast of Cuba and things like that. So that came as a bit of a surprise. And of course, the movement started with the 1953 attack on Moncada barracks.
And that attempt did not succeed.
That attempt didn't succeed. And possibly Batista didn't take them very seriously. After a few years in jail, they were all let off.
Right.
But fact of the matter was that Fidel and Raul both had participated in similar attempts in Dominican Republic as well as in Colombia. And then they tried the similar thing in Cuba. They were able to succeed because of a variety of factors. Maybe we can discuss it a little later. But one factor was Cuba had become virtually a kind of a enslaved nation under various leaders, because you should remember one thing: Cuba was the last country to become decolonized in 1898.
Right.
Whereas in the same Caribbean, you had 1804, you had Haiti, which was the first to get decolonized.
So there was a 100-year long period, through which decolonization happened in the entire Latin American continent.
And many felt cheated about the way after the victory over Spain, the Americans decided to impose
they wanted conditions. To control it, de facto be part of the United States without actually formally being part of it.
So that kind of a sense of resentment was there, and outrage
so
was there.
So definitely there was a sense building up within the Cuban people, to be able to chalk their own history and determine their own.
Exactly.
M.K. Tikku, to move on to trying to understand from you that how do you look at the causes which led to the rise of Fidel Castro, But also we have to try to understand that what led to the fact that the United States, despite the fact that it was propping up various regimes in Cuba, it definitely at one point they found that the brutality of the Batista regime had become so huge or so gruesome that they were unable to support it by about 58, 57, that is the time when it happened. How do you look at the causes which led to the Fidel Castro's movement finally becoming successful in Cuba?
There was a huge mass mobilization. But apart from that, there was an external climate, the World War. Either countries like in Asia and Africa were getting decolonized, and in some other places, military takeovers were taking place, or revolutions were, I mean, like it happened in Egypt, for example.
Right.
So a new generation of leaders was taking over, and you have to keep in mind that Cold War was already on. It was in fact close to its peak, and there was this East-West confrontation, and in that Cuba symbolized a certain kind of a 60s, you can say, a certain kind of hope. That's why Che Guevara became such a cult figure.
Professor Chattopadhyay, how do you look at the reason, and what led to the rise of Fidel Castro, and also that where was the strength of the movement coming from in terms of the composition of the people who came and supported?
It's a very good question. I mean, to start
they
with,
used to call it the movement of the 26th July, which was actually got its name from the failed movement of 1953. Now, what really led to the fact that the failed movement became the name for a later successful movement?
I would like to start where my friend Ash has finished. That 1953, that attack on the Moncada barracks, though it was unsuccessful, and Fidel, Raul, and Almeida, all the top leaders were jailed, and they were jailed for 3 to 4 years.
Right.
And finally, Batista regime, let them go. But then, when they consolidated themselves again, it is not that 25 or 27 odd people who launched, this movement. They had, somehow organized the unorganized people, in the sense the farmers. And you have to understand a very important factor which played in the 1959 revolution, that is the ethnic composition of Cuba.
Right.
Okay, Cuba's composition, ethnic composition in 1959, the demographic ethnic composition was 3 main segments. One was the whites, were descendants of the Spaniards, Creoles, and then there was a very big composition, the number of people belonging to blacks, who were brought to Cuba for sugar and tobacco plantation, and the mulattoes.
Right.
And if you see Fidel and Raul and all others, they are very ably tried to mobilize all these segments.
So which means that basically it was a broad social coalition.
Broad social coalition, especially the blacks and the mulattoes, who were at the receiving end much more than the Creoles during even the Batista regime.
Right.
Okay.
Receiving end from the government.
Yeah, from the Batista regime, actually. Right. So they were very successfully mobilized by Fidel Castro and all his companions, I would say, and that gave a really tremendous boost to the whole movement, to the revolution ultimately. Because if you see in 1959, when they started fighting from Sierra Maestra again, all the armed battle they started, it is the villagers actually who were not part of the 53.
Right.
They were
so they were fairly instrumental in coming out.
So this has also played a very important factor, in giving a tremendous impetus to this revolutionary movement.
Right. There is something else, which is related to the fact, we're talking about the social coalition which was able to build up. There's something which you indicated while speaking, there was this nascent internationalism also coming up. Che Guevara was an integral part of the movement which led to the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Che was from Argentina and then eventually went on to make his political home in Bolivia completely. So there was this, what led to the fact that in Latin America you had this seamless nations where radicals and revolutionaries, went from one place to another regardless of where they were born, but just unified by this basic concern of fighting for the poor and the oppressed people.
Yeah, that is because Latin America, there is a sense of integration because of language, because of similar colonial heritage. And also the racial
But that
mix.
was the case even in several other places, Africa for instance, but it has not been
Africa was much more complex because of the diversity of the colonial powers and also the kind of isolation.
But primarily you think that Latin America, since it's primarily Spanish, Portuguese.
Language and all that. So I think they felt that, okay, your revolution is indeed mine. And that was the kind of feeling. That's why you see that you have the mobilization of
But
every
this sense
leaders.
was not felt by the indigenous people of Latin America.
No, that part no. Yeah, that,
You're completely
you're very
different.
right.
Yeah.
It was
So
primarily
it was
among,
basically
among the mixed
the
population.
descendants of the Spaniards, who felt
Yes,
that
which
way
in
across.
any case are majority in large part.
Right.
So obviously. So that was the feeling. That's why one leader is going across to bring about a revolution or revolutionary impetus and things of the kind. That was happening. That was something very amazing. But these leaders did not stop at Latin America.
Right.
Even in the 60s, Che Guevara and his comrades were sent to Algeria, to Congo, and to other places.
Yes, they went to Africa.
Exactly. So
it was
they
very
thought that-
difficult, to go to Africa and actually not knowing the land, not knowing the people, not knowing the culture of the people, and yet going and trying to initiate a revolution. They obviously failed.
Exactly. And also, I think it had to do with the kind of American domination of the region. Remember that in the decolonization process begins so early. Say 1804, by 1810 you had Mexico, and by 1820s Argentina, Brazil, so many countries. And yet it remained an oligarchy, and very little change that happened. And that's why it is becoming ripe, because Americans were greatly instrumental in not allowing them to have a kind of a free say in affairs. And so I think that was building up, that the way they were humiliating, the way they were subjecting them to. So I say that was the reason. So you can say that some kind of a momentum was building up in Latin America. And yet the credit goes to Castro and his comrades to kind of bring about that kind of a revolution which had been crushed elsewhere. And why it happened, it was because of that something that we need to discuss, because of the kind of smartness, shrewdness, and pragmatism of more than anyone else Fidel Castro.
I think there was a very important role which was played in the Cuban Revolution by Che Guevara. Now, how do you look at it? This is a relationship which has actually been one of the most fascinating relationships, the relationship between two, romantic, heroes of Latin American radical culture. Che Guevara on the other hand, Fidel Castro on the other. M.K. Tikku, how do you look at the relationship which emerged between the two people?
I think it was essentially the Cold War context that internationalized the whole thing. I mean, barely two years after, a couple of years after, there was this Cuban Missile Crisis with the Soviet Union, and it almost came to almost close to a nuclear war.
Much closer than what was expected, the thought, at that particular time.
And according to one interpretation, it was partly provoked by misperceptions of each other.
We'll talk about that a bit, in a bit greater detail a bit later in the program, because that is to be really understood because of it being the heart of the Cold War. It's time for us to take a little break. I'm sorry that cutting you short. We'll come back and resume this conversation. When he was not even 30 years old, Castro led an unsuccessful revolt against the Batista regime. By the time of the Cuban Revolution, this government had acquired the image of being among the most brutal ones in history. Be with us. This program will continue. Welcome back to a page from history. 55 years ago, Fidel Castro became the Prime Minister of Cuba. He went on to transform Cuba into the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. Aparajit Chattopadhyay, before we went into the break, we are trying to understand this relationship between Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, and as to what was really, what really, to use a phrase of today, what's the chemistry between the two of them?
Well, I guess in the beginning it was fantastic. Both of them met in Mexico.
Later on, there were differences.
They never met in Cuba first. They met in Mexico, and Fidel was very impressed. Che was 2 years younger to Fidel by age, and Che was a doctor. Che was accompanied by his friend Granado. Both of them have toured already, the entire Latin America on motorcycle, and there's a famous film now. Yeah.
Yes.
So depicting all those things. But Fidel met Che in Mexico, and and of course they started this campaign, and they planned the whole assault, against Batista.
Right.
But the broader question is this, that it is not a secret that after they came to power in 1959, initially they pulled up quite well, both of them, but there were some difference of opinion between the two, and mainly on the process of industrialization and taking help from Japan and other countries, which Che was very keen to industrialize Cuba, because Cuba was surviving till the time of revolution and 5 years after that also, mainly on a monocultivation, on sugar and tobacco, and Che knew that that was not enough to sustain the population. So Che wanted to industrialize very quickly and rapidly, to which Fidel did not agree. And there was other also, differences of opinion. And secondly, as you said rightly, that Che was a person, who always thought of, I won't say use the expression who wanted to export revolution, because that is a wrong way of putting it. I would say that Che had a dream actually when he toured Latin America on his motorcycle, that the revolution has to be spread in other Latin American countries. And he did visit Bolivia on his motorcycle much before he actually went to Bolivia.
It was a very romantic idea of politics, and it was taken to very extreme limits by Che.
So, he left. But of course, there are a lot of, calumny, I will say, that, the Western world, and especially the United States, has said that it's Fidel who conspired, and got Che killed. But that's a different story.
A completely different thing. Ashnur and Roy, let's now try to deconstruct what Fidel was all about in ideological terms. Becomes politically active in the early 1950s. 53 leads a revolution, leads a revolt which is not successful, gets suppressed. They spent a few years, trying to prepare again. Then eventually, from 57 again, they try to regroup, and 58, 59, and then eventually the Cuban Revolution, 1959. Now, ideologically, at that time, though the world might have been calling him, or Americans might have been calling him as a communist, but he became a self-proclaimed communist much later on. Now, ideologically, in 1959, where did Fidel Castro and the political forces that he led in Cuba, where did they stand? We are talking about a situation in 1959, which is a decade and a half after the Second World War, after the Cold War beginning, yet not becoming very, it's not like eyeball to eyeball kind of a conflict. They're not staring at each other, which happens later on with Cuba becoming the theater of the real, the nasty phase of Cold War. I'd like to understand the ideological basis of Fidel Castro from you.
This is very important. You see, various interviews that Fidel gave during the struggle against Batista, as also in
during that time or later on when talking
during that struggle,
time,
as also in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Revolution, where he made conscious effort to distance himself from communism. Each time he was asked, he said that in case of conflict between democracy and socialism, I will be on the side of democracy. In fact, no less than a person that Che Guevara also said once about Fidel, that he is a left-wing bourgeois. This is the word.
Too much of a Democrat and too little of a socialist.
And that is very credible, because unlike Raul Castro, who was a member of the Communist Party, Fidel Castro had joined another party which was not a Communist Party. And of course,
so did they not have any conflicts because of this?
No, but then there were a lot of commonality. You see, in the Latin American context, being too nationalistic, being too an advocate of social justice, things of the kind, was understood as being anti-Yankee. I think that was given the context of American
and they framed it within the context of as anti-Yankee.
Exactly. So I think they didn't see much contradiction. Now, of course, there will be people who will say that, okay, Fidel was like watermelon, green from outside and red from inside and all that. But I think this is not fair.
But may I just add one more point to this? Fidel Castro in 1985, when he gave this famous interview to Father Beto, the Brazilian Dominican monk, actually, Fidel and the Religion. Now it's a famous book. Fidel said very categorically that till 1965 he was not a communist. He was not even a Marxist. And he says that he followed the paths of Jose Marti, the Cuban national poet, who also became a martyr, because he was a writer, but finally he went for an armed struggle, and he died. So Fidel said that my icon is Marti, and nobody else.
Tikuza, how do you look at the ideological basis of Fidel Castro? We are talking about this, whether he was a communist, whether he was a more a democrat, less a socialist. How do you frame or contextualize or deconstruct the ideology, the mind of Fidel Castro?
Of course, he was sort of, because of the American presence and because of what was going on around the world, and Cuba needed closer Soviet support. And
but that came much later on.
Yeah.
It's also basically related to this, that where does this so much of a strong anti-American sentiment come from? What were the Americans trying to do that made Cuba such a small nation, in geographically very tiny compared to United States, lies like a small little strip of land in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, just below the United States in the sea. Now, what was the American policy that resulted in so much of anti-American sentiment within the Cuban people?
American policy was to a large extent in that phase shaped by this Cold War rhetoric, and to an extent one could say the Americans themselves became victims of it. Take for example, I'm slightly digressing, Iran for example. Americans were supporting liberal democracy in Iran. And then the Cold War happened. And until then there were differences between British and the Americans, because Americans were pushing them for democracy and liberal society. And suddenly the Americans changed, and from then onwards Americans took a anti position, manipulated a coup d'etat in Iran, and the history of the last 60 years. And likewise, something similar was happening in the Latin American. And in one sense, it was the stuff legends are made of. Such a tiny country, so close to the United States of America, the biggest power, the biggest bulwark against communism, and being challenged. So the Americans couldn't take this, and their responses often were disproportionate.
You see, once again, this the entire Latin American country was facing the consequences of the Monroe Doctrine.
Right.
And that doctrine was that, you have no business to be here because this is our sphere of influence. So the sense of geographical fatalism and things like that, and that led to a sense that the behemoth of the North. You will be surprised to know that Fidel got some of these ideas from his father. His father had worked in the Spanish army, and he felt heavily cheated the way the Americans, led the Spanish to believe that their interests will be looked after. So he started hating them, and a lot of these ideas were transferred.
Also,
to
when one
his son.
looks at the history of Cuba, I'm not an expert, but one does comes across to these references to this Plath amendment, which possibly was the reason for continuous contentious issues between Cuba and America, which continues even now with the Guantanamo.
But there is another. I would like to add. I would like to add another point that is very important. We should not forget that around 1959 or the early 60s, entire Latin America was ruled by military dictators, whether it is Argentina, Chile, Brazil, any country.
Right.
So when the Cuban Revolution was successful, and they did some reforms,
it had a spiraling effect.
Agricultural reforms and other reforms they started doing in the beginning.
Which the Castro government did.
So US also found some kind of danger in it, because we know that USA and the CIA was supporting all the military dictators in Latin American countries, mainly to exploit the natural resources and the mineral resources of Latin American countries through US multinational companies. So they saw a danger actually in Fidel Castro, in Che Guevara, in the revolution, etc. So that is why the American policy became much more anti against Cuba within 2 years. And 62, the Americans went on a full-fledged war almost.
We'll talk about this, see what happened in 61 and 62. It's time for another break. I'll come back and resume this conversation. Within a year of assuming power, Cuba became the theater of two major conflicts that hastened the worsening Cold War. The Bay of Pigs operation, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 saw the world come very close to a nuclear war. In fact, much more than what was believed at that time. Stay tuned in. This program will continue. Welcome back to a page from history. It is 55 years since Fidel Castro became Prime Minister of Cuba. He initiated far-reaching changes, and these impacted developments through the world. Ashner and Roy, whenever we talk about Cuba, it's synonymous. We talk about 1961, we talk about 1962, we talk about the Bay of Pigs invasions, we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, possibly one of the worst periods that could have happened in the entire period of the duration of Cold War. Kennedy administration, lots has been written about the period. Your personal understanding and your personal explanation as to how this entire thing got precipitated in the beginning.
Yeah. Let me go back a little. When the revolution happened, Fidel Castro goes to United States in April itself.
Right, it's called by the press corps there,
yeah,
by the National Press Club, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there he met...
And the president does not meet...
yes, he met the Vice President Nixon.
Yeah.
And of course
Eisenhower doesn't meet him.
Yeah, exactly. And from there he goes to Canada, to Uruguay, to Argentina, and things of the kind. Then he comes back.
Right.
And yet he doesn't let anyone know exactly what the ideological leanings of the new regime were.
So he's a bit of a mystery at that time.
Exactly. Yeah. Then comes 1960.
Right.
He decides to once again go to United States during the General Assembly session, where he meets Nikita Khrushchev.
Right.
He meets senior leaders from Bulgaria and Poland, including Nasser and Nehru.
Right. And that is the time when there's a very strong anti-Cuba rhetoric during the election campaign in the United States.
Now, while he took his time not to let anyone know what his leanings were,
he got to sample how people thought of him.
But then when the Americans realized that things were different, so then they started working. Eisenhower administration, I think, sanctioned about $13 million dollars to the drug mafia and others, and then this happened. But one thing is very important before we discuss that, that it took some time for Castro to say that the nature of the Cuban regime is socialistic. That happened in 1961 in the beginning. But
that would have also happened right in the beginning. After he came, they went in for those reforms, land reforms, which basically took away land.
But formally he did not
stopped.
He did not use that word.
Foreign ownership of land in Cuba. I guess basically the cards of Castro was opening slowly, but he was not spelling it out. Mr. Tiku, how do you look at the beginning of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile? How did it really blow up? What was there in the mind of the American administration when they actually launched the Bay of Pig operations? Did it actually think that they would be able to, by sending these bombs, and be able to capture Cuba? What was the intention?
I mean, it was part rhetoric, part misperceptions, and part the logic of the Cold War, the confrontationist.
But why send bombers? Why did they actually think that they would be able to overrun?
One story is that they
miscalculation.
Yes, satellite images of a football field, and they thought it was a build-up of for war.
Right.
Yeah, and in any case, the American mood, the American public opinion had been so hyped.
So basically, there was pressure on what you're trying to argue is that there was pressure on the American administration to be able to satisfy the rhetoric of within the country, and then launch some kind of an offensive against Cuba in the Bay of Pigs. Is that the way you look at it? And how do you connect Bay of Pigs, which obviously ended in some kind of a disaster for the American administration? Then came the Cuban Missile crisis, which did end in some kind of a compromise between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Well, as you rightly said, that in 2 years after revolution, or within 2 years, Cuba has already started some reforms in the form of agricultural reforms, lot of reforms in the health sector, lot of reforms in education sector, etc., dismantling the last vestiges of the Batista regime, you can say.
Right.
And that was giving a signal actually that which path Castro was going to take. I mean, though the nomenclature was not very clear at that point of time, and the U.S. intelligence agency, I'm sure they knew about it, and Che has already visited, has met, not in USA but in a third country, the Russian, authorities. We all know about it now, and that I'm sure the U.S. intelligence agencies have come to know about this 61 meeting of Che with Russian authorities. So, as I told earlier also, that the US's main apprehension was this, that the Cuban Revolution should not spread to any other country in Latin America. It should be contained in Cuba. Okay. And they knew if the Soviet Union somehow, starts,
but the strategy was for containing it within Cuba. The strategy was to launch an offensive, a military offensive.
Contain, because they knew that probably they had the intelligence that it was difficult actually. It was a popular revolution. It was not a revolution which was done from the top or a very selected band of people did it. They were very sure about it. So they didn't want to do a genocide either actually. Okay, but because if you see the 1961.
Do you think that the Americans also got encouraged by the fact that after Castro took over, there was a certain amount of large-scale migrations which had already started from Cuba, not willing to stay there because of the economic policies which were definitely pro-poor. So this entire, the genteel class of Cuba. Yes, Mr. Tiku, you were wanting to say
something? I think romanticization of revolution in the 60s did play a part.
Did it play a part?
Yeah, did play. I mean, in creating a larger, almost an international, this thing.
And that is why it worried the
United States more.
Okay, but you see, the more than anything else, the decision to launch the Bay of Pigs operation, was guided by the feeling that, look, I mean, what is Cuba after all, in front of the big power? So the sense of arrogance that, okay, even the small operation of sending these drug mafia and all that who had been cut off because their interests had been affected, and we will be able to finish them. This is where there was also an element of misreading about the real strength of the Cubans. Cubans had realized that something was happening, and as we discussed a little while earlier, in fact, Castro himself meets with Nikita Khrushchev in September 1960.
In fact, this is something that the backdrop of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened later on, was this particular meeting. Now, at that particular time, why was Castro reaching out to the Soviet leadership? Was it because he was worried of having the Americans breathing down his neck all the time and not being very comfortable about the regime, and knew fully well that assassination attempts had already possibly begun against Castro?
You see, the kind of political course that Fidel Castro had taken, he knew that unless he has someone to protect, unless he has someone to turn to, Americans won't allow it.
So was he pushed towards the Soviets by the Americans?
Yeah. You see, ideologically, possibly they could have gone towards even maybe China, but then they knew that China was not in a position to underwrite the survival of the revolution. But remember another thing that has happened. What is the difference between 1953 and 1959-60? In 53, Russia was still not the exporter of oil. So from net importer of oil, it became exporter of oil, which was important because Cuba needed the energy. Russia was also able to buy at much higher interest the sugar, the monoculture.
And this is after the Americans stopped buying sugar.
It all fitted in. So I think the timing was very important, and so it needed someone like Russia to protect. And it's a different matter that Castro still continued with his revolutionary, objectives.
Now the question which arises, Aparajit Chattopadhyay, is that Castro does decide to take protection from the Soviet Union because of fear of being overrun by the American administration. How much of this protection actually undermined his own independence, or does he become actually a camp follower, to use a phrase of today?
Well, I personally don't think so, because I visited Cuba thrice at different stages, and I've seen, the protection was, of course, in the form of material, because the Soviet Union gave a lot of material support, especially helped Cuba in setting up industries and other things. But Castro was a very, very strongly independent-minded ruler, I would say, in Latin America. And that is why Castro is so, commanded so high respect among other Latin American statesmen. Even those who were ideologically opposed to communism or Marxism at that point of time. Because some of them, till 1970s, I would say, they used to see in Castro the last bastion, of resistance against the big North. And so Castro, I do not think, I mean, a lot of people say that Cuba became a satellite country of Soviet Union. That is
Which
the
was
language.
not the case.
So
Castro did retain his particular
Of
independence.
course, he retained it. Yeah.
Very important. MKT, could you also try to understand? We have to bring in India also somewhere. This is the time when Che Guevara definitely comes to India. After the Cuban Revolution. There are also the 1961 Belgrade meeting of the non-aligned movement. So how is the rest of the world? We are talking about America, we are talking about Soviet Union, we are talking about Cuba. But there's also these huge parts of the world which comprise various other countries, including this huge emerging bloc of the non-aligned movement. How was it being looked upon, and how was the regime in India looking at these developments?
Well, between
what
the
were its interests?
non-aligned movement and the leftist movements, I mean, these were often termed as natural allies. And so the Americans were the others. But given the polarization of international politics at the time, I mean, you can see, for example, in 1971, India signs the
peace treaty with the Soviet Union.
Right. And Americans repeat the same mistakes, backing the Mujahideen.
No, that is why the Americans used to say that non-aligned movement is basically an extension of the Soviet bloc.
Yes, but in any case,
that was not the case in 1961.
That was not the case, and it had its independent basis and independent reasons and an independent position, which happened to be closer to the Soviet position rather than the Americans.
Right. How do you look at it, Ashnan?
Yeah, let me say, Fidel Castro in 1961 was working on more than one track. One track is he
working on more than one track, engaging with more than one group.
Exactly. So while he was seriously pursuing the non-aligned camp,
right,
and that's why it became the only country from Western Hemisphere to join the founding summit in Belgrade. But he was at the same time also exploring and had already established contact with the Russia and all that. So I think this was a very smart move. As far as the non-aligned movement was concerned, a movement which had primarily members from Africa and Asia, and many other Latin American countries were not very positive towards the movement, knowing that it is a movement of the newly decolonized countries. We are the old states or things of the kind. So they welcomed Cuba because they were able to get a membership from that part, and that was a time of decolonization, anti-imperialism and things of the kind also went very well. So I think it helped both the sides.
Right. I think you said it very well. We'll take another break and then come back for the final segment. Located in the Caribbean Sea, Cuba has been an eyesore of sorts for countries in the Western Hemisphere. Fidel Castro has been a source of inspiration and condemnation. Whichever way one evaluates his legacy, Castro remains a towering personality of the world. Do not go away. We'll be back for the final segment. Welcome back to a page from history. 55 years ago, the world saw the rise of a towering personality in Cuba, Fidel Castro. Aparajit Chattopadhyay, quite often it is said that Fidel Castro was singularly responsible for the economic stagnation and the closure and the closed world within which the Cuban economy operated, that this caused enormous hardships and resulted in primitive technology continued to be used beyond decades in Cuba.
Well, I would like to answer it only one single sentence. Did he have any other option at that point of time, at least in the beginning? No. Clear no. Because, he was not getting the support, adequate support actually to sustain the economy. And we know the American blockade actually, we started, within a couple of years from the revolution took place in 1959. And much later actually, when fortunately, when China, you can say after 1970, Chinese also started supporting, I'm talking about material support, which is needed to run a country. Okay. And Cuba, unfortunately, at the time of revolution had no kind of industry, we know it.
Right.
No kind of industry. It was mainly surviving.
It was a very small country also, and
on
it could not have,
sector. Even
it was
today,
a very small country and could not have had much
even
industry.
Today also, Cuban economy, 52% of the GDP of Cuban economy is based on service sector. Actually.
Right.
Okay, agriculture.
It would be primarily a country which is dependent on imports.
Tourism and
on imports and tourism.
So they had no other choice, and this infamous blockade imposed by the Americans, and and different kind of restrictions they imposed not only on Cuba, but they made other countries of Europe and others who were trying to help some.
What were they trying to achieve by this economic blockade? Just trying
at
blackmail
a given point of time, I guess in the late 70s, US had then understood that any kind of military adventurism will not pay. Probably they have learned a lesson from Bay of Pigs and from other things. So they thought that the other way of controlling or make how Castro can be thrown out, or Castro's regime can be thrown out, was to put this severe economic blockade.
I think you made a very valid point. Let me get a reaction from MK Tikku on this. That military strategies to get Castro out were not working. So the Americans decided to actually tighten the screws and squeeze Cuba economically. They could not even succeed on that count. Why? How did they kind of sustain themselves?
Who, the Cubans?
Yes.
Yeah, Cubans, I mean, they did sort of close the economy. That is true, but I mean, let me point out, they did rather well on social sector in terms of
health, education,
healthcare, and so on, which is creditable. And this was the standard American model, I mean, to sort of squeeze the country, and they thought they would
squeeze it sufficiently so that they're not able to generate resources for the social sector to ensure that there will be an uprising.
Not only social,
and this would result in some
bring
kind
about
of uprising
economic breakdown. I mean, of course, the coup in Iran was a matter of it cost the CIA about something like $75,000 on it. And but today it looks really like a page from history. It is the same Raul Castro, the first communist, who today is inviting foreign investment, has just started importing foreign cars, and is now opening up to tourism. So the world is changing, and even Cuba is changing.
So, Ashnaran Rai, would you say that in some way, since 2008, from the time Raul Castro became, the head of government of Cuba, some way or the other, the wheels of history have begun to turn backward in Cuba?
Well, I will say it this way. There is with the advent of Raul Castro, you have a continuity as well as change.
Right.
Now, what change you see is liberalization, yes, but democratization, no. And this is exactly what, when he came, people thought there will be Sino-Vietnamese model of economic opening. But
something very similar to what has happened in China.
But it hasn't happened because they are possibly too scared, because they are too close to United States, and a large number of Cuban refugees are not only living so close to them, but they are
also
very
the economies
active.
are interconnected. They keep on visiting, they keep on sending, remitting money. So it's a huge amount of money which possibly comes into Cuba from.
Now, even some of the changes that have been introduced are very modest. In terms of allowing the citizens to go out, travel, but then there is no guarantee that you will be given the passport and things of the kind. Lot of limitations still in terms of disposing of your property and all that. You can import a car, but what is the price of it? Nearly $500,000, something like that. I mean,
there's something interesting about which. This dual currency system
that has stopped.
Yeah. But there is another advantage. I think let's not lose sight of that. That how Cuba tried to survive in the initial years of Russia's retreat. Then they had a much more difficult time. What they called that living doing more with less. And that's why suddenly you have because no petrol, so you had all cycles and things of the kind and all that. But then a kind of a lifeline was provided by Venezuela, and the integration of Cuba into the Committee of Latin American Nations. Tourism started growing, and then Raul Castro started opening up so much so that you have today 250,000 people who are into private jobs, self-employed category and things of the kind. So I think that's important. Another important thing is that hundreds of thousands of people have been trained or educated, or also helped medically internationally by the Cubans. So I think Cubans have, despite all the limitations, always tried to create a space for themselves. And that makes it great. That legacy becomes very important. Because even when it was dependent on Russia, internationalism was not compromised.
Right.
You know, and that's why that happened thanks to one man, that is Fidel Castro, who was partly romantic revolutionary, but
also
partly
essentially
pragmatic.
very pragmatic.
Pragmatic. And this is exactly how, that's why I think the credit goes possibly more than Che Guevara or more than anyone else. It was thanks to his personality and his vision
Right.
that Cuba was
So before
able
we
to
start
come this
talking
far.
about the final legacy of Fidel Castro, very quick word from you, Professor Chattopadhyay. Change in Cuba after Fidel stopped, being in political power.
Well, I mean, we have information from European countries. I mean, I would like to add to what Ash finished, where he finished, that Cuba also found a friend in European Union from 1992, which is a great change. Initially, all the European countries, mainly because of this NATO, they were under the American pressure not to provide any
So
help
after
to
the end of the
Cuba.
Cold War, even the European
But
countries had greater
1992
elbow room and they
onwards, European Union completely changed. And we know countries like France, Germany, and of course Spain. Spain has a different kind of connection.
Canada all along.
So they started helping Cuba in the sense of sending more tourists, and by giving other kinds of help, aid, etc., etc. Of course, I know. I mean, we all know actually from the newspapers, European newspapers, mainly from the Spanish newspapers, that Spanish government, especially when there is a socialist government in Spain 5 years back, they tried their best to have some kind of negotiation, to bring back democracy to Cuba. Okay, through a proper.
Bring back, meaning when was
bring
there
back?
Cuba?
No, bring back in the
Democracy
sense,
in
yeah, there was
Cuba,
democracy, but in the sense,
not been
you
there
can say,
for
you can
decades.
say to democratize Cuba,
So to say,
okay.
yeah.
And they negotiated. There's a backroom, discussion between Raúl Castro and other leaders, and Felipe González, the charismatic Spanish leader, etc. Because they wanted a very smooth transition in Cuba. Spain has a very umbilical connection, with Cuba. But somehow that did not, result in a very, very positive way, I would say.
Right. So the question is very related, because I just cannot but stop from asking this. Can there be a democratic transformation of Cuba? Do you see it happening in a few years from now?
Over a longer term, maybe.
Not in the short
but
term.
change is inevitable. You can see it. I mean, the fact that Raul is changing his
Right.
rhetoric, his policies, they are.
Well, he's now going to be in office in 2018.
Okay.
But maybe
but there
thereafter-
is a groundswell of public opinion, both inside Cuba and Cubans outside, who want change, who want more openness. So, and it
Some
seems
kind of greater participation in
engagement.
the
Yes,
decision-making
engagement
process.
is the new diplomatic language.
Right. You think that is possible?
Yeah,
Some kind
But
of
it will be
democratic change?
painfully slow. It won't
Yeah, okay,
happen
yeah.
dramatically.
Painfully slow. I
Yeah,
think that's
yeah.
a very important
You see,
point.
you see, when the Berlin Wall collapsed,
Right.
then Octavio Paz had written an article in Los Angeles Times
Way back
saying
in
that
November 1989.
89. He said that Castro will go Ceausescu way, and we saw that it didn't happen. So I think there is something in the Cuban leaders that they have become very unpredictable in terms of their longevity and all that. But there is another good sign that has come, and I think just today the news has come that there is an opinion poll organized by Atlantic Council in the United States
Right.
among the Congress members and others, and overwhelming number of Americans,
Cuban Americans.
as well as Americans as well as people from Miami, Florida, they support normal relations with Cuba. This is a good sign. And of course, the conservative and all that are saying that no, you are manipulating this, but then Atlantic Council is quite independent. So I think there is a good sign that there would be some change in approach from the Americans as well. That you must try to kind of open up to them, and if that happens, then Cuba will also do, because Cuba can always feel very uncomfortable so long as Americans are so hostile to them.
Right. As we move into the concluding part of this discussion, Professor Chattopadhyay, Fidel Castro is no longer active in the public space, sphere. He's completely withdrawn. The final legacy of Fidel Castro, what would the world remember him for? What would he be appreciated most for, and what would he be condemned most for?
Well, he would be appreciated always, in the history by everybody, all people who love freedom, dignity, etc. For the tremendous fight he has given over so many years, 50 years, more or less, active leadership in Cuba. And not only, he never did it for only for a tiny island called Cuba. He is
for a much larger cause.
Indisputable leader of the entire Latin America, actually. All Latin Americans
basically stood as a bulwark against the hegemony of any nation, be it the United States, be it any other
cutting
country.
across all ideologies prevalent in Latin America, yesterday, today, tomorrow. He
and what would be he be remembered for his biggest shortfall?
Well, this I think let us allow
democracy,
admit the history.
Democracy, iron fist, some kind of an authoritarian.
Well, this is what precisely, I won't comment now because it's only 55 years of the revolution.
Let history
decide. It's too early to decide.
I think Fidel Castro will be best remembered for standing up to the Americans.
Right.
And he paid a price, Cubans paid a price, yes.
Right.
But would Cubans have been much better if Fidel Castro hadn't been there?
Right.
I have my doubts.
Right.
Well, I would say that thanks to Fidel Castro, Cuba may have been a very small nation, but it had a foreign policy of a big nation, which made such an impact globally that it became a global actor and a global phenomenon, a global voice. And I think that is possibly the biggest
legacy. In fact, if you go around people, and take an survey of people who do not know much about international geography, they'll not be able to understand that Cuba was such a small little nation. They'll think it was a huge country which actually stood up to the Americans and to the rest of the world who wanted to hegemonize other smaller nations. Thank you very much for coming and joining on this program. It's really been very nice and very knowledgeable to have the three of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Most Cubans kept their faith in Castro until the end of his political life. In the last few years, Cuba has moved on, and the stamp of his brother Raul is now more visible. But the hallmark of Fidel Castro still remains imprinted on the fate and destiny of not just Cuba, but maybe much more. We hope this program has provided you with enough food for thought. Do write to us at historylistv@gmail.com. We will return next week. There will be another page from history and another panel of experts. Till then, goodbye.